For my graduation, my parents gifted me a disownment letter. My sister, ever the performer, lifted her phone and smiled into the camera. "Let's record this moment," she said, her tone dripping with amusement. I unfolded the envelope slowly, the sound of paper slicing through the hum of conversation. Inside, a single sheet of crisp white paper bore the words, "We hereby disown Clara Johnson, effective immediately." I read it once, twice, and felt nothing. Maybe because I had already mourned this family long ago, in every dinner where silence was my only companion, in every glance that said I was the afterthought. I folded the paper neatly, slipped it into my bag, and looked up with a calm smile. "Thank you," I said softly. "This gift makes everything clear." Then I pushed back my chair, the scrape echoing through the restaurant, and stood. Behind me, I could hear a few forced laughs, the click of my sister's camera still recording. They thought I was walking away in shame. But the truth was far simpler. I was walking toward the life they could never reach, one that no signature could erase. Have you ever been made to feel like you weren't enough, even by the people who were supposed to love you the most? Tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there. I'd love to know who's sharing this moment with me. I grew up in a family where reputation was currency and affection was conditional. My father, Robert Johnson, managed wealth portfolios for high-net-worth clients in Chicago's North Shore. My mother, Elaine, ran a charity foundation that hosted glittering fundraisers at hotels with marble floors and silent string quartets. My sister, Vivian, was their masterpiece, a corporate lawyer in New York, engaged to the son of an established family. And then there was me, Clara, the unfinished sketch. At every dinner party, my mother performed the same introduction like a script she'd perfected. "Vivian is a senior associate at a Manhattan law firm," she'd say proudly, resting a hand on my sister's shoulder before glancing toward me with polite indifference. "And Clara? Well, she's still studying for her MBA." Guests would nod, their smiles tight, as if they could sense that being me was a social inconvenience. I used to think if I worked harder, if I achieved more, they'd finally see me. But in our house, achievements without prestige didn't count. My part-time job at a coffee shop near campus, the one that paid my rent and kept me fed, was seen as a failure. My father once said, "No daughter of mine should smell like espresso." He meant it as a joke, but the way he wrinkled his nose told me it wasn't. Every Sunday dinner became an unspoken exam. They asked about my grades only to measure them against Vivian's promotions. My mother's voice always carried that subtle blade of comparison. "Still studying, Clara? Don't you think it's time you settled down, maybe found some stability? Vivian was already working full-time by your age." When I didn't answer, my father would sigh and refill his wine glass. "Degrees don't pay bills," he'd say, staring past me at the crystal chandelier. "Success is measured by numbers, not paper." The irony was painful. He measured love the same way he measured profits, by return on investment. And since I had none to offer, I was simply expendable. I learned to disappear quietly. I'd come home from campus only when necessary, sitting through dinners that felt more like board meetings. My sister talked about wedding venues in the Hamptons. My parents discussed donors and dividends. I, the invisible one, nodded at all the right moments. Sometimes, my mother would turn to me and ask with that soft, cutting tone, "Still at that little cafe? You must meet such interesting people there." The table would laugh. I would too, because not laughing made it worse. There was a time I tried to tell her about my research project, about the data-driven logistics model I was building. She blinked once and said, "That's nice, dear," before returning to Vivian's story about an upcoming case. That was when I realized affection in our house was a privilege granted to whoever reflected best on the family name. Outside that house, though, life felt different. The hum of the coffee grinder, the soft chatter of students, the smell of roasted beans, it was the only place that felt real. I learned more behind that counter than I ever did at those dinners. I learned how to read people, how to manage chaos, how to lead without a title. Sometimes, my classmates would come in, and I'd help them brainstorm business ideas between orders. They respected me in ways my own family never had. At night, when the shop closed, I'd walk the quiet streets back to my small apartment. The city lights shimmered on the river, and for a moment, I could breathe. It wasn't luxury, but it was mine. I'd brew one last cup of coffee, open my laptop, and work on my capstone project until sunrise. Every key I pressed was a promise to prove that worth doesn't need their approval to exist. Still, every time my phone buzzed with a family message, I felt that familiar tension return. Photos of Vivian's new condo, her diamond ring, her smiling fiancé at charity events, always followed by my mother's caption, "Proud doesn't even begin to cover it." Never once did they post about my scholarship, my published paper, or the project that my professor said could change the way small businesses move goods. None of it mattered to them. To them, I was the quiet daughter who hadn't figured it out. I started to understand the unwritten rule of our family. Love was a transaction, and I had nothing to trade. By the time I reached my final semester, I stopped trying to earn their approval. I still showed up to dinners when invited, still smiled when introduced as the one still in school, but inside, something had shifted. The shame had turned into distance. And that distance, cold and lonely as it was also my first taste of freedom. During my second year, I received a research scholarship, one of only 5 awarded nationwide. My professor told me the committee was impressed not just with my work but with how I led my team. "You've got something rare, Clara," he said. "You make people believe in the impossible." That night, I texted my parents. "Award ceremony this Friday, 6 p.m. at the University Hall. It would mean a lot if you could come." I waited all week for a reply that never came until the morning of the ceremony. My mother sent a short message. "So proud of you, sweetheart, but we have a charity gala tonight. You understand." A few minutes later, my father added, "Big night for your mother's donors. Take photos." I stood on stage that evening under bright lights, my name echoing through the hall. Flashbulbs went off, applause filled the room, and for a moment, I let myself imagine their faces in the crowd. But when the clapping stopped, the emptiness returned like gravity. Afterward, I sent them a photo of me holding the award, the gold seal catching the light. My mother replied an hour later, "Beautiful." One word. No question, no call, no pride, just polite acknowledgement, like she was reacting to a piece of furniture. That was when I stopped sending photos. Every holiday carried its own quiet sting. Thanksgiving dinners where I'd drive home after my shift, exhausted but hopeful, only to find my achievements had become invisible again. My mother would pour champagne and raise a toast to Vivian's promotion or her fiancé's new job. "To our family's shining star," she'd say. I'd smile, swallow the bitterness, and remind myself that resentment never feeds you, it only eats you. But some nights, after everyone left, I'd sit alone in the guest room, staring at the trophies I'd once been so proud of. They didn't sparkle anymore. My father always had a way of turning praise into punishment. One night, I told him I'd been invited to present a paper at a logistics summit in Austin. His face barely moved. "That's great," he said flatly, then after a pause. "But success isn't about papers, Clara. Success is money. When you can afford to buy your own house, then I'll be impressed." I wanted to tell him that research was the first step toward innovation, that money was a result, not a goal, but I'd learned that logic doesn't work on people who only listen to applause. So I stopped going home unless I had to. The house that once smelled of cedar and cinnamon now felt like a museum built for everyone except me. My mother's foundation plaques lined the hallway, Vivian's framed degrees covered the staircase, and on the mantel sat a single family photo where I was half cropped out. Maybe it was just bad framing. Or maybe it was deliberate. Either way, I saw the truth my absence made their picture perfect. In the months that followed, I buried myself in work. I took extra shifts at the cafe, sometimes closing at midnight before heading straight to the library. My project became my refuge, a logistics platform designed to help small businesses find efficient shipping routes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. The equations made sense when people didn't. The data listened when my family didn't. I'd spend nights tweaking algorithms, losing track of time until the first train passed outside my window. In those quiet hours, I didn't feel small or invisible. I felt alive. There were nights, though, when exhaustion cracked my resolve. I'd scroll through family photos online. Vivian in designer gowns, my parents at charity dinners, champagne flutes in hand, and wonder what it felt like to be worth celebrating. I told myself I didn't need them, that I was building something greater, but loneliness has a way of whispering at 3 a.m. It reminds you of every door that closed in your face, every word you wish had been different. Still, I never let it win. I'd take a deep breath, open another spreadsheet, and keep building. When people at school talked about family support, I learned to stay quiet. My version of support came in the form of reminders that I wasn't enough, but it also became fuel. I started channeling every slight, every dismissal, into focus. If they saw me as a failure, I'd turn failure into foundation. I didn't realize it then, but that quiet defiance was the start of my transformation. The turning point came quietly, like most good things do. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when Dr. Peterson called my name after class. He was a tall man in his 60s, the kind of professor who saw potential where others only saw attendance. "Clara," he said, adjusting his glasses, "you've got an unusual mind for this kind of work. You see both the numbers and the people behind them." I blinked, unsure how to respond. Compliments weren't something I was used to receiving, especially not from someone who meant them. He pointed to my presentation slides still projected on the screen, rows of data turned into clean, dynamic patterns. "You organized a team of 6 and predicted distribution efficiency down to 0.1%, he continued. "That's not just math, that's leadership. Have you considered presenting this at the Student Startup Symposium next month?" I almost laughed. Me? The girl who spent nights poring over logistics spreadsheets between cafe shifts? "I don't think I'm ready," I said, careful not to sound ungrateful. He smiled, the way mentors do when they already know your excuses. "Perfection is just fear dressed up nicely," he replied. "Apply, you might surprise yourself." That evening, I sat in my apartment staring at the application form. My cursor hovered over the blank space labeled team name. I thought of all the times I'd been told my ideas were too small, too academic, or not practical. And yet, here I was, with something that might actually matter. I texted 2 classmates I trusted: Ryan, a data analyst with a quiet wit, and Lila, a UX designer who could make algorithms look beautiful. Within a week, we were a team. We called our project Pathlink, a system that used real-time data to help small businesses optimize shipping routes and reduce fuel costs. We wanted to make logistics fairer, smarter, and accessible to everyone, not just big corporations. For 3 weeks, my apartment turned into our command center. Empty coffee cups lined the table, sticky notes covered the walls like a kaleidoscope of determination. We worked through sunrise after sunrise, driven by something I hadn't felt in years: a sense of belonging. The day of the symposium, I wore the only blazer I owned, the one I'd bought secondhand for job interviews. My palms were sweating as we set up our booth among dozens of flashy startups with glossy banners and corporate sponsors. Compared to them, we were tiny, a team with 3 laptops, a borrowed projector, and an idea built on hope. But when our time came, something shifted. The moment I began to speak, the noise of the room faded. I walked the audience through our problem, our process, our purpose. I spoke about small businesses struggling with inefficient deliveries, about data being a tool for empowerment, not exclusion. Lila navigated the demo with confidence, Ryan presented the algorithm results, and when it came time for closing remarks, I said, "We believe efficiency should serve everyone, not just those who can afford it." Applause erupted. Real applause. Not polite, not perfunctory genuine. For the first time, I didn't feel invisible. Afterward, several attendees stopped by our table to ask questions, exchange cards, and offer suggestions. But one conversation stood out. A man in a tailored gray suit approached me with quiet confidence. His name tag read, Richard Hale, CEO, Arden Logistics. I recognized the company instantly. They were one of the biggest distribution firms in the country. "Impressive work," he said, his voice low but steady. "You've got something interesting here." I started to thank him, but he held up a hand. "Not just the idea," he said. "You." I froze. "Me?" He nodded. "Most people talk about innovation like it's magic. You talk about it like it's responsibility. That's rare." He looked over our demo again, then added, "You have a gift, Miss Johnson. You understand both people and numbers. That balance, that's what builds lasting systems." Before I could respond, he handed me his card. "Call my office sometime. I'd like to hear more about Pathlink." And just like that, he was gone. No promises, no flattery, just the kind of sincerity that left me speechless. When I told Dr. Peterson afterward, he smiled knowingly. "Some people chase opportunities," he said, "others create them. You just did both." That night, I walked home in the cool spring air, clutching the business card like a secret. For once, I didn't need anyone's approval to feel proud. I didn't need my mother's polite applause or my father's acknowledgement. I had built something that spoke for itself. Back in my apartment, I placed the card beside my laptop and whispered to no one in particular, "Maybe this is where it starts." And though I didn't know it yet, that tiny spark, the courage to present, the belief that my work mattered, was the beginning of a fire that would one day change everything. The more Pathlink started to take shape, the more my family tried to dismantle it. It was almost poetic. The closer I got to becoming someone, the more determined they seemed to remind me of my place. A week after the symposium, I called my mother to share the news that Arden Logistics had shown interest in my project. I barely finished my sentence before she sighed. "Clara, darling, playing with computers all day isn't a career. You should be networking, attending real events, meeting real people. You spend too much time chasing ideas that won't pay the bills." Her voice was calm, clipped, and utterly dismissive, the same tone she used when talking to waiters or housekeepers. I wanted to tell her that data was about people, that behind every number was a driver trying to make rent, a small shop trying to survive shipping costs, but I knew better. To her, understanding people meant hosting luncheons and appearing in charity magazines. "I just wish," she continued, "you'd stop embarrassing yourself with these little tech hobbies and do something practical. Your father could get you a position at his firm tomorrow." When I didn't answer, she handed the phone to him. "Clara," my father said, his voice carrying that rehearsed authority he used with clients. "You need to stop turning down real opportunities. You're not a child anymore." "I'm working on something that matters to me," I said carefully. "What matters," he interrupted, "is stability, not dreams." There was a long pause before he added, "I've told people you'd join my company's analytics division after graduation. Don't make me look like a fool." That was always his way, turning my independence into an insult, my boundaries into betrayal. I said nothing, and the silence stretched until he hung up without a goodbye. An hour later, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Vivian. "You really should stop this fantasy, Clara. Not everyone gets to live in a dream. Learn to be realistic. Nobody buys ambition if you can't turn it into cash." I stared at her message for a long time, the words glowing like tiny knives on the screen. Then I locked my phone, turned off the light, and sat in the dark. For days, I went through the motions like a ghost. I'd go to class, meet with Ryan and Lila, smile at their optimism, and then crumble quietly when I got home. The stress started to bleed into everything. My hands shook when I typed. My heart raced for no reason. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., with my mind spinning through to-do lists that never seemed to end. Some nights, I'd catch myself staring at the ceiling, whispering, Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm not enough. Eventually, I booked an appointment with the campus health center. I didn't even know what to say when the therapist asked what brought me in. I'm tired, I said. But not from work, from being told I'm wrong for wanting more. She listened quietly, then asked me to describe my week. I told her about the deadlines, the calls from my mother, the constant expectation to apologize for being different. When I finished, she said something that still echoes in my mind. Clara, it sounds like you've spent your whole life living in other people's definitions of worth. You need boundaries, not walls, but lines that tell you where you end and they begin. Her words hit harder than any lecture I'd ever heard. Boundaries. I didn't even know what that meant anymore. My entire life had been shaped by their approval, their disapproval, their conditions for love. Without realizing it, I had built myself as a reaction to them every decision, every silence, every achievement. For the first time, I wondered what it would feel like to make a choice that was entirely mine. That night, I took out a notebook and made 2 columns. What they want and what I want. The first list filled quickly status, control, appearances, predictability. The second started slow, hesitant, but then poured out freedom, creation, peace, purpose. By the end, the second list was longer. That realization didn't fix everything, but it felt like breathing for the first time after being underwater. Still, the following weeks tested that newfound clarity. My father left voicemails about saving face, my mother emailed links to job openings, and Vivian continued her passive-aggressive texts about how hard work only counts when people notice. But I stopped replying. I poured myself into Pathlink instead. I spent late nights refining the software, reviewing user feedback, and helping local vendors test the system. Slowly, the chaos in my mind started to quiet down. Yet the anxiety never disappeared completely. Some mornings, I'd wake with a tightness in my chest, wondering if I was delusional to think I could make something of my own. But then I'd remember Dr. Peterson's words, the look in his eyes when he said, "You see both the people and the numbers." That was my anchor. I began meditating before work, journaling after meetings, and reminding myself that boundaries didn't make me selfish, they made me sane. And though my family's voices still echoed in the background, they were getting quieter, fading under the rhythm of my own. I didn't know it yet, but I was standing at the edge of something extraordinary. The chaos, the exhaustion, the loneliness, they weren't signs of failure. They were contractions before birth. And what was about to be born would not only change my life, it would make my family realize that the daughter they dismissed had already built a world beyond their control. It happened on an ordinary morning, the kind that feels too quiet before something shifts. My inbox was cluttered with unread newsletters and half-finished drafts when I saw the subject line that froze me mid-sip of coffee. From Arden Logistics Corporate Partnerships. Subject: Proposal Discussion, Pathlink. For a second, I thought it was a prank. I reread the sender's address 3 times before opening the message. It was short, almost disarmingly so. Dear Miss Johnson, we've been following your project since the Student Startup Symposium. We're interested in discussing potential collaboration opportunities regarding Pathlink. Are you available for a meeting this Thursday at 10 a.m.? Best, Richard Hale, CEO Arden Logistics. My heart slammed against my ribs. I checked the calendar to make sure it wasn't April Fool's Day. Then, slowly, I smiled, not the forced, careful smile I gave at family dinners, but something deeper, quieter. The meeting was held at Arden's downtown Chicago headquarters, a sleek building of glass and steel that looked like it had been carved out of ambition itself. The lobby smelled faintly of cedar and polished stone. I arrived 10 minutes early, clutching my presentation folder like a shield. A receptionist guided me to the executive floor where everything gleamed: glass doors, minimalist art, the hush of expensive carpet. Richard Hale greeted me with the same calm authority he'd shown at the symposium. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. Your presentation impressed a lot of people, he said. But I want to hear more about what you want from this. Um. I hesitated, expecting a trap disguised as a compliment. What I want? He nodded. Yes. Suppose we gave you full control. No board, no shareholders, no politics. What would you build? For a moment, all the noise in my head, my parents' disapproval, Vivian's texts, the late-night doubts fell away. I took a breath. I'd build a fair system, I said finally. A logistics network where the smallest businesses don't get crushed by the big ones, where data helps people, not just profits. Everyone deserves to be seen. He leaned back, his expression unreadable. Then a faint smile tugged at his mouth. That, he said, is exactly the kind of vision this industry needs. The rest of the meeting was a blur of charts, technical demos, and cautious optimism. He asked sharp questions. I answered without flinching. By the time I left, my nerves had melted into adrenaline. I didn't dare believe anything would come of it, but as I stepped out into the crisp wind, I felt something shift inside me, the quiet certainty that my life had just turned a corner. 2 weeks later, a follow-up email arrived. Arden wanted to license Pathlink for trial implementation. 3 months after that, the deal closed. Purchase amount: $6.2 million. I read the figure over and over again, my breath catching each time. It felt surreal, like numbers on someone else's screen. The agreement also included a full-time position, Director of Data Operations, Arden Logistics, starting the following quarter. My name, in black and white, attached to a title I had only ever dreamed about. I called Ryan and Lila first. We screamed into our phones like kids on a roller coaster, half laughing, half crying. They were beyond thrilled, already talking about what came next. But when they asked if I'd told my family, I hesitated. Not yet, I said. They wouldn't believe it. Or worse, they'd say it's luck. That night, as I stared out my apartment window overlooking the Chicago River, I thought about how they'd react: my mother's patronizing smile, my father's skepticism, Vivian's smirk. I could already hear the words. $6 million for an app? People throw money at anything these days. So I kept it to myself. I signed the papers quietly, met with Arden's legal team, and watched my life change in silence. When the funds transferred, I didn't buy a car or a designer bag like Vivian would have. I paid off my student loans. I moved into a modest lakeview condo with floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the morning light. The first night there, I sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor, drinking cheap champagne from a mug, laughing softly at how peace can taste better than luxury. The next morning, I framed the official offer letter and placed it on my desk. Underneath, I slid the old Disownment draft I'd written in my mind years ago, the one that began, "I hereby release myself from needing your approval, effective immediately." As the weeks passed, I started preparing for my new role, attending briefings with Arden's engineers and strategy teams. Each day felt like breathing air I didn't know I'd been missing. People listened when I spoke. My ideas mattered. And for the first time, the girl who used to hide behind data was leading people who believed in her vision. Sometimes, I'd still get texts from home, forwarded photos from charity events, announcements of Vivian's wedding date, reminders about the family image. I'd read them, smile politely, and then set my phone face down. They had no idea who I'd become, and I wasn't going to explain it. Because success, I learned, doesn't always need witnesses. Sometimes it's enough just to know that you've crossed the invisible line between who they said you were and who you've chosen to be. I didn't know it yet, but the next time my family and I sat across a dinner table, it would be at a restaurant with white tablecloths and glittering chandeliers, the same kind of place where my mother once lectured me about respectability. And this time, she'd be the one holding an envelope. Only, the lesson she thought she was teaching would belong to me all along. The message came on a Friday evening, 2 days before my graduation. My phone buzzed with a familiar chime, my mother's number. "Tonight, the family is hosting a pre-graduation dinner for you. Dress appropriately." No heart emoji, no exclamation mark, just that clipped tone that always sounded like an order disguised as affection. I stared at the screen for a long moment, debating whether to go. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but another part, the part that still clung to hope that maybe, just once, they'd see me, whispered, "Show up. End it on your terms." The restaurant was called Maison Lumière, one of those French places my mother adored because the menu didn't list prices. Gold light spilled from crystal chandeliers, the air thick with the scent of butter and quiet judgment. When I stepped inside, 15 familiar faces turned toward me, relatives, family, friends, people who'd known me since I was Vivian's shy little sister. They all smiled the way people smile when they've been told to. Every phone on the table was angled subtly toward me, cameras ready. "Clara, darling." My mother rose with that theatrical warmth she saved for public occasions. Her silk shawl shimmered as she gestured to the seat beside her. "You look lovely. Everyone, let's toast our scholar." The waiter poured champagne. Glasses clinked. My father gave a rehearsed smile, saying, "We're proud of you, kiddo," without looking me in the eye. Vivian adjusted her diamond bracelet and added, "Finally finishing, huh? Took long enough." Laughter fluttered around the table like champagne bubbles, fragile, artificial, gone too soon. Dinner began. The conversations were a blur of polite small talk, Vivian's wedding plans, and my mother's charity events. No one asked about my project or my plans. I answered questions when necessary, smiled when expected, and kept my hands steady on the linen napkin in my lap. But something in the air felt rehearsed, staged. Like I had walked into a play whose ending everyone knew but me. Halfway through dessert, my mother tapped her spoon gently against her glass. The room quieted. "Before we eat," she said, eyes gleaming under the soft lights, "we have a special gift for Clara, a symbolic one." But, from her designer handbag, she pulled out a white envelope. Thick paper, my father's neat signature across the seal. She handed it to me with both hands and a dazzling smile. "From all of us." Laughter rippled faintly through the table. My sister lifted her phone again, recording. "We want to capture this moment," she said. My pulse slowed. The chatter faded. The envelope felt heavier than it should. I opened it carefully, unfolding a crisp sheet of paper. The words were printed in bold black ink. "We hereby disown Clara Johnson, effective immediately. We relinquish all financial and familial ties. This is a necessary lesson for someone who confuses education with wisdom and refuses to listen to family guidance. Signed, Robert Johnson, Elaine Johnson, Vivian Johnson." The words blurred for a moment before sharpening into something almost comical. They had actually written it out, signed it, and printed it, a family declaration dressed up like a legal document. I looked up. Every face was turned toward me, waiting. Some amused, some curious, some smug. It was a performance, and I was the final act. My mother leaned forward, still smiling. "We just thought this might help you face reality." Vivian giggled behind her phone. "Come on, Clara, don't look so serious. It's just a message, a wake-up call." Doll. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, steady and calm. For a moment, I almost pitied them, the desperation behind the cruelty, the way their validation depended on watching someone else shrink. Then I folded the letter neatly, slipped it back into the envelope, and smiled. "Thank you," I said, my voice even, almost gentle. "You're right, this makes everything clear." There was a flicker of confusion in my mother's eyes. "What do you mean?" I stood, smoothing the creases of my blazer. "I mean, now I can finally start living honestly. Without pretending this is a family." The table went silent. My father cleared his throat. "Don't make a scene, Clara." I met his gaze. "A scene? No. I'm just leaving the stage." I placed the envelope on the table, right beside the untouched glass of champagne, and turned toward the door. Behind me, chairs shifted, whispers swelled. Vivian called after me, her voice sweet and cutting. Don't forget, Mom and Dad will still be at the graduation tomorrow. We have to look like a family, you know, cameras and all. I paused at the doorway, just long enough to glance back. Of course, I said quietly. Appearances are everything, right? And then I walked out. Outside, the city hummed. The night air tasted of rain and freedom. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight slide off my chest. In my bag, my phone buzzed with messages from Ryan and Lila about tomorrow's ceremony, about the press coverage that was building around the Pathlink acquisition. I smiled. They had no idea what had just happened, and my family had no idea what was coming. As I waited for the cab, I caught my reflection in the restaurant's glass, calm, composed, unrecognizable even to myself. For years, I had been the invisible daughter, the quiet one, the disappointment. Now, I looked like someone who finally understood her worth. Behind those glittering windows, they were probably laughing again, raising their glasses to my supposed humiliation. But I didn't feel humiliated. I felt clean, like someone had cut the final thread tying me to a life that never wanted me. The cab pulled up. I slid inside, the city lights flashing across my face as we drove away. Tomorrow, I would stand on a stage again, this time, under brighter lights, in front of cameras that weren't staged by my mother or my sister. And when my name was called, when the truth finally came to light, I wouldn't need to explain a thing. They thought tonight had broken me. What they didn't know was that this dinner, this cruel little performance, had freed me completely. The next morning, the campus buzzed with the hum of celebration. Purple banners draped the university courtyard, fluttering in the spring wind. Rows of white chairs lined the graduation hall, each one polished to perfection, each seat waiting for a story to end and another to begin. My name was printed in gold on the program: Clara Johnson, Master of Business Administration. I sat in the front row, the fabric of my gown rustling softly as I tightened my grip on the speech cards in my lap. The air smelled faintly of roses and old wood polish, the kind of scent that clings to ceremonial rooms and nostalgia. Students whispered, laughed, fixed their caps. But I sat in silence, my heart steady in a way it hadn't been in years. Somewhere behind me, I heard the click of a camera, my sister's phone, no doubt. I didn't need to turn around to know they were there. My mother, my father, and Vivian had taken their places in the VIP section, front and center as always. I could picture them perfectly. My father's controlled posture, my mother's impeccable smile, my sister's subtle glance at the recording app on her screen. To everyone else, they were a proud, elegant family. Only I knew the truth that just 12 hours ago, those same people had signed me out of their lives like a transaction. The university president gave the opening remarks, his voice echoing through the hall. Applause followed, then laughter, then silence again, as the announcer began to read the list of honors. I tried to focus on the words, but my mind drifted. I thought about the letter from last night, now folded neatly in my drawer, not as a wound, but as proof. Proof that I had survived them. Proof that their approval was no longer the currency I lived by. When the MC reached my name, I heard it before I felt it. The recipient of this year's Young Leader in Technology Award is Clara Johnson. For a second, the room seemed to freeze. Then came the applause, sharp, thunderous, rising like a tide. I stood, my legs trembling slightly, and began the slow walk to the stage. My eyes brushed past my parents' faces, my mother's frozen smile, my father's unreadable stare. My sister's hand moved subtly, adjusting her phone camera. The MC shook my hand, his voice carrying warmth and pride. Miss Johnson's innovative work with Pathlink has inspired collaboration, innovation, and change across the logistics industry, he said. Her leadership and vision have earned her not only this award but also the attention of one of the country's largest corporations. My heart skipped. I hadn't expected them to say it. He smiled, turning toward the audience. And today, we are proud to announce that her startup, Pathlink, has just been officially acquired by Arden Logistics, one of the most significant deals of the year. The room erupted. Cameras flashed, cheers broke out, and somewhere behind the blinding lights, I saw my mother stand abruptly. My father's jaw tightened. Vivian's phone slipped slightly in her hand. Every reaction was being recorded: the shock, the disbelief, the ripple of realization moving through the room like a current. The family that had disowned me less than a day ago was now sitting in front of hundreds of witnesses, forced to applaud the daughter they'd tried to erase. I stepped up to the podium, the gold seal of the university glinting beside me. The applause faded into expectant silence. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing against my ribs, the kind of silence that asks for truth. I took a slow breath and looked out at the sea of faces: students, professors, families, and then, finally, at them. "Thank you," I began, my voice calm but strong. "Thank you to every professor who saw potential where others didn't. And thank you to the people who told me I wasn't enough. You taught me how to stand." The room was silent for a heartbeat, then erupted again, louder this time, not out of politeness but out of recognition. Behind the applause, I saw my mother sink back into her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. My father stared straight ahead, his expression carved from something brittle. Vivian looked down, pretending to fix her bracelet. The MC congratulated me once more, handing me the plaque, but I barely heard him. My eyes were on the cameras, the ones broadcasting the ceremony live on the university's social page, the ones catching every flicker of reaction in the VIP row. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same people who had once crafted every public image, every family photo, every post for prestige, now trapped in an image they couldn't control. When the ceremony ended, people swarmed around me: classmates, professors, even journalists. "Congratulations," they said, shaking my hand, taking photos, asking questions. I smiled, answered politely, posed when asked. I could feel my phone vibrating in my pocket, message after message pouring in. I didn't check. I already knew who they were from. Eventually, the crowd thinned. I slipped out a side exit, into the cool air. The sun had shifted, glinting off the rows of parked cars. My heels clicked softly against the pavement as I made my way toward the courtyard fountain. That's where I saw them waiting: my mother, my father, and Vivian. My mother was the first to speak. "Clara," she began, her voice lighter now, desperate for grace. "You should have told us. We could have helped you prepare for all this attention." I almost laughed. "Helped?" I echoed. "You disowned me last night." Her face faltered. "Oh, darling, that was just a misunderstanding, a symbolic gesture. You know how we are with lessons." My father stepped forward, his tone measured. "You made quite the impression today. Art and logistics, that's impressive. I suppose we underestimated what you were doing." Vivian stayed silent, her eyes darting between us. I tilted my head, studying them the way one might study a painting, beautiful from afar, hollow up close. "You didn't underestimate me," I said softly. "You erased me. There's a difference." My mother's smile cracked. "Clara, don't be dramatic. We're family. Let's not air private things in public." "Then maybe," I said, "you shouldn't have made it public first." For a long moment, no one spoke. The air hung heavy between us, filled with the sound of the fountain and the faint echo of applause still drifting from the hall. I adjusted the strap of my bag and turned toward the gate. "I have a meeting in an hour," I said, though I didn't. "Arden wants to discuss the onboarding process." My father blinked. "They already offered you a position?" "Yes," I said simply. "Director of Data Operations. Starting next month." My mother's lips parted, but no sound came. Vivian finally found her voice. "You're serious?" I smiled. "Completely." They just stood there, a picture of shock and quiet disbelief, the kind of silence that once would have crushed me. But now, it only made me stronger. I started walking away, the sound of my heels echoing like punctuation marks to the life I was leaving behind. As I reached the street, I turned back one last time. They were still standing there, small against the backdrop of the grand building, framed perfectly in the sunlight, the same people who thought they could define me. Now they were just part of the scenery. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the background. I was the story. By Monday morning, the story had already escaped the walls of the university. Someone in the audience, maybe a student, maybe a journalist, had recorded my mother's reaction during the ceremony. The clip went viral overnight. The camera zoomed in on her frozen smile just as the MC announced that Arden Logistics had acquired Pathlink. The caption read, "When the daughter you disowned becomes the youngest tech director in the country." It spread like wildfire. By lunchtime, the video was trending on multiple platforms, tens of thousands of comments, half outrage, half awe. People called it the calmest revenge ever. Others wrote, "She didn't need to scream. Her success did it for her." My inbox filled with messages from classmates, strangers, even recruiters. For the first time, my name was being spoken without pity attached to it. The press picked it up next. An online business magazine published an article titled, "MBA Student Disowned by Family Becomes Youngest Director at Arden Logistics." The piece quoted parts of my graduation speech and ended with a line that made me pause. Perhaps the greatest education is learning when to stop seeking approval. But not everyone was celebrating. The fallout at home began faster than I expected. My mother's charity foundation, once praised for its elegance and family values, became the center of controversy. Donors began withdrawing support, citing ethical concerns and reputation risk. Some of the same people who had toasted her at charity galas now distanced themselves entirely. By the end of the week, her office released a statement that the foundation would be undergoing structural review. My father faced his own reckoning. At his firm, colleagues whispered about the story behind the viral video. Clients began asking uncomfortable questions about leadership integrity. One of the partners reportedly told him, "Robert, perception is everything in this business. You can't be the man who publicly disowns his daughter on camera." By Friday, he was placed on temporary leave pending review of company image issues. Vivian wasn't spared either. Her fiancé's family, Old Money, Old Values, saw the video and the headlines and decided the association was inappropriate. They asked for space. Within a week, the engagement was quietly called off. I heard from a mutual friend that Vivian's firm suggested she take a short leave of absence to reconsider her public visibility. For a family obsessed with image, the collapse wasn't just personal, it was existential. And yet, I felt no satisfaction in it. Only distance. While their world unraveled, I moved into mine, a modern apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, sunlight flooding through tall windows each morning. It wasn't huge, but it was mine. The walls were white and bare, waiting for meaning. I spent the first evening unpacking boxes, the silence of the place wrapping around me like calm water. The first thing I hung was my framed diploma, gold lettering, embossed seal, the proof of every night I'd worked while the rest of my classmates slept. Next to it, I placed my new contract with Arden Logistics. The official letterhead gleamed under the light. Director of Data Operations. My name. My title. My future. Between those two frames, I pinned a small piece of paper, creased, smudged, and precious in its own twisted way. The disownment letter. It was no longer a wound, but a reminder. A line drawn between the person I used to be and the one I'd become. Every morning, I'd catch my reflection in the glass of those frames, the girl who once begged for approval now standing taller, quieter, stronger. I no longer needed to prove anything. The world could keep its applause. I had peace. Still, there were nights when the echoes found me, the faint hum of my mother's laughter, the chill in my father's silence, the sting of every comparison I'd endured. I'd sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the lake ripple under the moonlight, and whisper, "I made it out." The city felt alive beneath me, the sound of trains, the rhythm of footsteps, the soft hum of possibility. I started planning a new program with Arden, a mentorship initiative for young women in tech, especially those from families like mine who were told they'd never be enough. I didn't tell the press. I didn't announce it online. Some things didn't need a spotlight to matter. Occasionally, I'd receive letters addressed to my new office, some from strangers thanking me for being the voice of calm revenge, others from students asking how to start over after being dismissed by their own families. I replied to every one of them. Sometimes with advice, sometimes with silence. Because not every story needs a loud ending, some just need to know someone understands. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the lake, painting the water in gold, my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "We saw the article. You made your point. Can we talk?" I stared at it for a long while before turning the phone over, screen down. I wasn't angry, I just didn't need to answer anymore. I looked around my apartment, the bookshelves, the clean desk, the soft hum of the fridge, and smiled. I had built a life where their voices couldn't reach me. And between the two frames on the wall, that small wrinkled letter stayed exactly where it belonged, not as a scar, but as proof that sometimes, the things meant to break you are the very things that set you free. A week after the article hit its final peak of virality, I came home from work to find a bouquet waiting at my door. White lilies and soft pink roses, the kind my mother used to order for charity events. The card was tucked neatly between the stems, written in the familiar looping cursive that once signed my report cards and permission slips. "No matter what happens, you'll always be our daughter. Love, Mom and Dad." I stood there for a long moment, the scent of the flowers sweet but oddly hollow. A year ago, that note might have undone me. I might have called, cried, begged for understanding. But now, I just felt still. I brought the bouquet inside, filled a vase, and placed it on the kitchen counter, not out of sentiment, but habit. Then I took out my phone, opened a new message, and typed slowly. "You both already signed something else that says otherwise. I'm just respecting your decision." I stared at the words for a moment before pressing send. No anger, no sarcasm, just truth. A clean, quiet boundary. Their reply never came. And that was fine. The next morning, the city was bathed in soft gold as I walked to work. Chicago had begun to thaw from winter's grip, and the lake shimmered like liquid glass under the sunday. My badge clicked against my blazer as I stepped into Arden's lobby, greeted by the familiar hum of elevators and the low murmur of people who had started to know me not as the girl with a scandal, but as Director Johnson. It still felt surreal sometimes hearing that title. Every meeting, every presentation, every time a colleague knocked on my office door and said, "Director Johnson, we need your approval," something inside me settled a little more. Not out of pride, but peace. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't fighting to prove my worth to anyone. I was simply living it. Work filled my days, but not in the exhausting way it used to. I spent my mornings reviewing data reports, afternoons mentoring interns, and evenings walking home past the Riverwalk cafes, the lights dancing on the water. On some nights, I'd cook dinner while listening to old jazz, the kind my father used to play on Sundays, though I didn't do it for nostalgia, just because I finally liked the sound. People at work often asked me how I stayed so calm under pressure. Once, during a late meeting, a junior analyst named Maya said, "You're always so centered, Clara. How do you do it?" I smiled, stirring my tea. "I learned that silence can be power," I said. "And boundaries are peace." She tilted her head. "Boundaries?" I nodded. "It's like this. Family, work, love, they all test where your edges are. But boundaries aren't walls, they're doors. You get to choose who walks through." She thought about it for a moment, then said quietly, "That's actually beautiful." I just smiled. It wasn't that I had forgiven everything. Some wounds don't need forgiveness to heal, they just need air and time. I didn't hate my family anymore, and I didn't love them the way I used to either. What I felt was something softer: acceptance. Acceptance that they might never understand me, and that was okay. Sometimes I wondered if they still talked about me at dinner parties, if my mother rehearsed a new version of the story, one where she'd always believed in me. one where the disownment letter was just a motivational joke. Maybe she did. But that was no longer my concern. The only truth that mattered was the one I lived every day. One Friday evening, I stayed late at the office to finish a report. When I finally stood to leave, the office was quiet, city lights flickering through the glass walls. As I walked down the corridor, I caught my reflection in the window, professional, composed, but not cold. There was warmth now, in the way I carried myself. I paused, thinking about the girl who used to sit in the back of her family's car, staring out the window, trying not to cry when her mother compared her to Vivian. If I could reach back through time, I'd tell her, "You don't need to earn love from people who only know how to give conditions." The elevator chimed softly. I stepped in, pressed the button for the lobby, and exhaled. Each floor we passed felt like another layer I'd shed: the guilt, the fear, the craving for their approval. When I reached the ground floor, the night air wrapped around me like a calm embrace. I walked along the street, the lake shimmering in the distance. For a moment, I stopped and whispered to myself, "You're home now." Because home wasn't an address or a last name. It wasn't Sunday dinners or family portraits. Home was peace. And as I stood there, watching the city lights blur into the horizon, I finally understood what I'd been chasing all along. It wasn't revenge, it wasn't validation, it was belonging to myself. Later that week, during a company retreat, one of the senior partners asked me to give a short talk to the team about leadership. I walked up to the podium, the same calmness I had felt at graduation settling over me. "People often ask me where I learned leadership," I said. "The truth is, I learned it from loss. Because sometimes, when the people who are supposed to guide you choose not to see you, you have to learn to see yourself. Family isn't always the place you're born. Sometimes, it's the place where you're finally seen." The room was silent for a beat before the applause came, not loud or dramatic, but steady, genuine. As I looked out at their faces, kind, respectful, present, I realized that maybe this was what real family looked like. Not people who shared your blood, but people who shared your belief that you mattered. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was still healing. I felt whole. A year later, I walked through the same university gates I once left behind with a folded disownment letter in my pocket. The air smelled of spring again, crisp, full of beginnings, but everything felt different now. The banners still hung in purple and gold, fluttering above the courtyard, but this time, my name wasn't printed as a student. It was printed on the program as Guest of Honor Clara Johnson, Director of Data Operations, Art and Logistics. The auditorium was already half full when I arrived. I could hear the faint murmur of excitement as students took their seats. A few whispered, recognizing me from the viral video that had never quite faded from the internet. It wasn't a scandal anymore, it had become something else, a symbol people used when they needed proof that quiet endurance could still win. As I stepped backstage, an event coordinator greeted me. "Miss Johnson, thank you again for doing this," she said warmly. "Your story has inspired so many of our students." I smiled. "It's not really my story," I said softly. "It's everyone's who's ever been told they're not enough." This time, I wasn't here to receive anything. I was here to give. Over the past year, I'd worked with Arden to establish a new scholarship program, one designed for students who came from nothing, who carried the same invisible bruises I once did. We called it the Build Your Own Table Scholarship. Because some people aren't offered a seat, they have to carve one out of the world themselves. When they introduced me, the applause filled the hall like sunlight. I walked onto the stage slowly, feeling the familiar texture of the wooden floor beneath my heels. My heart wasn't racing this time. It was steady, calm, free. "Good afternoon," I began, smiling as hundreds of faces looked back at me. "Standing here feels surreal. It's been a year since I sat in one of those seats, waiting for my name to be called, wondering if I'd done enough to deserve applause. Today, I want to talk about something different, about what happens when the applause never comes." The room grew still. "There was a time," I continued, When I thought love had to be earned, that success meant nothing if it wasn't approved by the people I called family. And when they took that approval away, I thought I'd lost everything. But I hadn't. What I lost was noise. And in the quiet that followed, I found my voice. I let that sit for a moment before smiling again. If anyone has ever told you that you don't belong, that you're not smart enough, strong enough, or worthy enough, don't waste your energy proving them wrong. Thank them. Because they've just handed you the reason to build something greater than their understanding. 1. Applause erupted again. Not polite this time, powerful, resonant, like a collective exhale from people who'd needed to hear it. As I spoke, I glanced instinctively toward the section where my family had sat the year before. The row was empty. I had known it would be, but seeing it still brought a small, unexpected ache. And then, quietly, peace. The kind that doesn't demand closure, just understanding. I used to think healing meant reconciliation, I said softly. But sometimes, healing means finally letting go of the version of yourself that needed to be chosen. My voice didn't tremble. It didn't break. It was grounded, the voice of someone who had learned that closure doesn't come from others' apologies but from your own acceptance. I want this scholarship to be for the ones who build their own tables, I continued. The dreamers who keep showing up even when no one's clapping, the people who find light in the cracks of being overlooked. Because sometimes, the tables we're excluded from aren't worth sitting at anyway. The audience stood. I could see tears, smiles, nods of recognition, not for me, but for themselves, and that was enough. Afterward, as the ceremony ended, I stayed behind for a moment, letting the empty hall settle back into silence. The stage lights dimmed slowly, washing the room in gold. I looked up again at the empty row, the one where my mother's pearls once caught the light, where my father's folded hands once looked so certain. It was just air now, space reclaimed. And in that silence, a thought came to me, not bitter, not triumphant, just true. I no longer look for their praise. Because the day they cut me off, I found myself. The camera crew filming the event panned toward me, capturing the small, genuine smile that lingered as I gathered my notes. Later, that clip, my smile, the line of sunlight crossing my face, would become the closing frame of the school's highlight video. They called it The Day Clara Johnson Came Home. But I knew better. I hadn't come home. I had built one. Outside, the air was soft, carrying the faint scent of lilacs from the gardens. I walked toward the courtyard where the lake shimmered in the distance. Students waved as they passed. Some stopped to thank me. One girl with trembling hands said, "You made me believe I can do it too." I touched her shoulder and said, "You already can, you just needed to hear it out loud." As I stood there, the sun breaking through clouds, I felt something settle in my chest, a quiet ending, or maybe a beginning. I turned once more toward the camera filming the post-event feature, smiled, and said the only words that felt right. If you've ever been underestimated, tell me where you're watching from. Because sometimes, losing their approval is the most beautiful gift you'll ever receive. And with that, the scene faded, my silhouette against the lake, the purple banners fluttering behind me, the story of a woman once disowned, now wholly her own.